For those of you already in the Zoom room, just to let you know, we are expecting several hundred people to join us this morning. So I'm just going to wait a few more minutes to let more people populate the Zoom room before I go ahead and begin the briefing. So just bear with us for a minute or so. All right. Well, good morning to everyone in the Western Hemisphere. Good day, good evening to everyone in the Eastern Hemisphere, and welcome to another of the Middle East Institute's Zoom briefings. I'm Ken Pollack. I am the Vice President for Policy here at the Middle East Institute. It is wonderful to have you join us. I did want to timestamp us. This is an on-the-record session, and we will be not just live streaming it, but also posting it later on our YouTube channel and on our website. And for those of you who may be watching that, just to let you know, it is 11 a.m. on the morning of March 9th, Monday, March 9th. So please do not hold any of the speakers responsible for things that may transpire after this point in time. With that, again, we are on the record, and we've got three terrific panelists. I will introduce them in just a moment, but before I do that, let me just say that my plan is to talk to our panelists. I'll ask them some big, broad questions, hopefully the most important questions that all of you are interested in hearing about for the first 30, 40 minutes or so of the webinar. And then I'll open things up to the audience for your questions. If you'd like to ask a question, you are welcome to do so. Please do it using the Q&A function on Zoom. If you're not familiar with the Q&A function on Zoom, you can find a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Go to the bottom of your Zoom screen, and in between the green share button and the show captions button, you'll find that Q&A button. If you click on that, it brings up a dialog box. You can type your question into that dialog box, and then I will pose them to our panelists as we move along. I'll typically collect a whole bunch of them because it's often that several people ask the same or similar questions, and I'll put that to the different panelists. Okay, again, we have a fantastic panel for you this morning. Once again, we're joined for the first time in these Zoom briefings by Lieutenant General Sam Mundy. Sam is a former U.S. Marine. I guess once a Marine, always a Marine. I apologize, still a Marine, just no longer active duty. General Mundy retired as the commander of U.S. Central Command's Marine Corps component, MARCENT, as it is known. In addition, General Mundy had a number of different interesting posts. In particular, he was the man sent out to Riyadh after the 2019 Iranian strike on Abqaiq and Khurais to help bolster Gulf air defenses. And so, especially given what's going on, I thought in particular very important to have General Mundy come and talk to us about the air defenses of the region and how the Gulf states and the United States are dealing with the missile and drone attacks that the Iranians have been launching. So we'll be joined today by Alex Vatanka. Oh, and I apologize. I should also point out the epitome of Lieutenant General Mundy's military career, which is that, of course, he is now a distinguished military fellow of the Middle East Institute. General Mundy is joined by Alex Vatanka, senior fellow here at MEI, our great Iran expert, and Colby Connelly, also a senior fellow here at MEI, and one of our terrific energy experts. And I'll just note that Colby is himself in Dubai. Hopefully it will be calm, peaceful, certainly through this webinar, but through the duration of the war. General Colby, Alex, welcome. Great to have all of you with us. All right, I'm going to dive right in the interest of time. And Alex, I'd like to start with you. Obviously, big news over the weekend. Give us a few thoughts about the election of Mustafa Khamenei as the new supreme leader. What do you think, and what's your reaction to that?
Ken, 10 days into this war, I have to say, I'm wondering if Ali Khamenei got the kind of death that he would have wished for, being essentially killed by United States and Israel, two countries that he obsessed over throughout his political career, and they finally essentially killed him. And they did so in the month of Ramadan. And for 86-year-old, I can only imagine what history will have to say about this in terms of from the perspective of those people who are his supporters. And I've heard many Iranians who support Khamenei say he could not have died in any different way, that this was destined to be. That's really interesting. Tells us something about the mindset of the supporters of the Islamic Republic. Now, turning to his son, Mujtaba Khamenei. Look, Mujtaba is this 56-year-old behind the scene operator. I know he has the title of Ayatollah. To the best of my knowledge, I don't know if he actually qualified, for that title. He has been much more of a political operator, as I said, than being someone who studied in the seminaries. In fact, we know his father, Ali Khamenei, had asked him to spend more time studying the scriptures and less being engaged in politics in Tehran. And I would say, the fact that he became supreme leader was not preordained. In fact, we know Khamenei, based on a number of different reports that we have, didn't want his son to succeed. Above all, he didn't want the idea of a father-son succession process. This is exactly what the 1979 revolution was all about, ending the hereditary monarchy. And now they're doing that. The reason why so far they've done it and they're getting away with it isn't because Mustafa Khamenei is a great political, player in his own right, in the sense that he doesn't necessarily have a base in society. I think there are two videos out there with him speaking. He's not someone that the outside world knows well. As I said, inside operator. But the reason he got the job is because the Revolutionary Guards wanted him to be the successor, and they don't care about the optics of this. They want continuity. They want someone from the bait, from the supreme leader's household. But that somebody's not going to tell the IRGC what to do. So for those of you out there who are thinking this guy could decide to be different than his father, he might decide to go in a different direction. He might actually surprise us by maybe pursuing reform. Those things are all, I think, at this moment, sort of more wishful thinking than anything else. It's the IRGC that's running the show. They gave him this job. And I know people will talk about the Assembly of Experts, and happy to talk about why Assembly Experts didn't matter in this context. It's who's got the power. And the people who have the power are exactly the people who are firing the missiles and the drones. That's the Revolutionary Guards. They wanted Mustafa Khamenei to have this job. And he will reflect their wishes, at least in the short term. If they want to continue this fight, he will reflect that. If they want to sort of look for off ramp, he will reflect that. It will take, at the best, for Mujtaba Khamenei a number of years to become an independent voice. The office doesn't give you power. It's the personality of the occupant of the office that gives you power. It takes time. His father had the same issue. Ali Khamenei took a number of years before he became the sort of person that we knew him to be at the end, this micromanager and so on. So I will just say, extremely important decisions lie ahead for the entirety of what's left of the regime. But it's going to be a consensus at the ranks of the Revolutionary Guards commanders at senior level. And I will, by the way, I will include people like Ali Rajani and Ghalibaf and so on also in that camp. They all have connections with the IRGC. They come from that world. And they have to make a decision. Regime survival is served best how? Stay in this fight. If the Americans want to get deeper into this fight, you still stay in it, or you look for a way out. And Mujtaba, as I said, would be the symbolic image for now to maintain the theocracy as the men in uniform decide what's best for them and the regime going forward. I'll stop there, Ken.
That's great, Alex. Before I move on to General Mundy, any other things that have happened over the weekend that caught your eye on the Iran side?
The one thing that people I know initially were very kind of hopeful of, and I was quoted in the media on that, this sort of idea of internal friction within the regime. And I just want to link it up to what I just said about who is actually driving this forward as far as Tehran is concerned, the Revolutionary Guard. So Masoud Pezeshkian, as you know, again, kind of gave an apology to the neighboring states. And, within hours, he had to walk that back and said, that's basically not what I said, or something along those lines, which tells you, yes, the office of the presidency, again, he's part of the three-man interim council. Again, I say that just because there's this hope that there would be wiser, more pragmatic voices who might be more having more sway going forward. And that might be the case going forward. But as of right now, as this war is raging on, it's the ideological core of the regime that is essentially in the driver's seat.
Fantastic. All right, General, let me bring you in. And as I said in my intro for you, I'd love it if you could start with the air defense picture. And how are you seeing these retaliatory attacks from Iran, and how well the Gulf air defenses are holding up? How do you see that given your involvement with this issue?
Sure, Ken. And it's great to be with you and Colby and Alex this morning. Let me, if you don't mind, start on a little bit more of a somber note and just reflect the fact that last night or overnight, we had our seventh U.S. serviceman killed, and that's tragic in any regard. And as well, two civilians in Saudi Arabia who were nearby, as I understand, were also killed. So partner country suffered some casualties as well. Just a good reminder that there's costs to this war. Now, having said that, the way I would judge the integrated air and missile defense, or just the general air and missile defense state, is it's been pretty successful thus far. I mean, if you look at the number of drones that have been fired, probably at least 3,000 and more than 600 ballistic missiles that Iran has fired, the interception rate has been 90%. So judging it from that perspective, you'd have to say that it's been pretty successful. Now, the audience out there might say, well, what about the other 10%? Well, sure, of course we want to get after the other 10%, but no system, no defense is perfect. And I don't mean to be cavalier about that. There are reasons for it, and I can go into that if you want. But in terms of the integration with our partners, and this is something that actually has a long thread back in time. And I don't want to go back to Genesis, but I'll just say that this is what we're witnessing is the culmination, not really a culmination, but the progression of a very deliberate effort over the last 2.5 decades to get after the problem of Iran's ballistic missiles. Less so the drones, that's kind of a new feature, but the ballistic missiles. You could probably draw a thread back to a pretty famous exercise called Millennium Challenge in 2002. It's covered pretty well in Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink, where you can see kind of what happened. And it exposed some weaknesses in the U.S. way of war. One of those was responding to saturation by ballistic missiles. Coincidentally, it also, the officer who played the Red Team commander, it was a retired Marine general by the name of Paul Van Riper, PK Van Riper, and he also swarmed the Persian Gulf with small boats too. But this problem rapidly became, along with other Iranian threats, something that the air and missile defense community focused on as the pacing threat, if you will. We hear a lot about the pacing threat today as China. It's all about China. Well, 2.5 decades ago, the pacing threat for the air and missile defense community was this ballistic missile threat from the Iranians. And they embarked on a very deliberate effort to improve through training, technical improvements, collaboration with our partners to really get after this problem. You can then kind of fast forward, and you mentioned, thanks for the head nod there, about 2019 and my role going into Saudi Arabia. 2019 followed, of course, just 3 months later by the killing of Qasem Soleimani. And that was the closest that we had really come to open conflict with Iran since the late 1980s. And so that was also, renewed emphasis both among our partners as well as, the U.S. Forces in the region to really kind of stay together on this problem, or to the degree that they could, to integrate. There was also recognition over the years that our partners were buying U.S. systems, Patriots, and of course THAAD systems, the TPY-2 radars that can see long and deep. And so it really made a lot of sense to try and knit this together. In fact, I remember I was in a meeting with 2012, I'm going back here, a meeting with General Dave Goldfein, who was the senior Air Force commander in the region. He later retired as the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and my boss, General Mattis. And coincidentally, it was in Riyadh, and we had just had a meeting with the senior Saudi leaders. They left the room, and General Goldfein looked at General Mattis and said, "Wouldn't it be a great idea if we could, pull this together? I think it's ripe for a regional approach to integrated air and missile defense." I'm not saying it was born in that moment. The idea probably preceded that, but it certainly made a lot of sense. So now, of course, you could also fast forward to 2024 and the way that the US helped defend Israel. And so all of these events leading up to where we are now have improved our ability to provide the air and missile defense coverage that we're all seeing. And is it perfect? Of course not. Like I said, 10%, we'd love to intercept all of them, although sometimes you don't have to intercept it if it's just going to fall in an open field. And that's what the whole, the beauty of this system is. They can see where it's going. They can see if it's going to come in and hit here or in a different location. It's not, as I understand it, I talked to a couple of people familiar and very close to the problem. It's not, I would describe it as cooperative. We're still progressing forward toward interoperability. It's not at the speed of light, if you will. So there are some systems that still need to be connected, but we are, of course, sharing information and tipping and queuing and making sure that we all know and especially airspace coordination, which plays a huge role in all of this. I know that the question has come up about magazine depth. So in answer to your question, it's been in the news a lot lately. It is something probably that we want to keep an eye on. I mean, I've studying this yesterday and listening to some other experts talk about this. I think the conservative estimate is that there's been an expenditure of probably 1/5 to 1/4 conservatively of the stocks. But the initial race to beat down the Iranian ballistic missile threat has largely put that in our favor. So yes, reason to watch it and keep an eye on it, and I'm sure that Admiral Cooper is, but probably no reason to get overly concerned. And of course, that also depends on the country that we're talking about. I know Colby's in Dubai. We had a discussion. We were in the waiting room about the drop in attacks just that they've experienced out there today. But the UAE's suffered a lot of attacks. At one time, they were being struck more by Iranian missiles and drones than Israel. And so it depends on the country. And I'm sure that, there's some things, some mitigation measures that we can do to help them out. But on the whole, I would say the assessment is it's going well. It's not perfect, but things are definitely in our favor. And I'll pause
Thanks,
there.
General. And there's one other thing that I was hoping you'd talk a little bit about, and I know it's a big subject, so whatever your top lines are, but there has been a lot of conversation about inserting either Marines or special forces to help with certain missions, possibly securing Iran's highly enriched uranium. Again, I know from my own experience, having participated in planning and war games with the U.S. military, looking at a contingency in the Strait of Hormuz. One of the ideas that was always out there was the possibility of, again, landing Marines or special forces around the northern shore of the Strait of Hormuz to try to clear out the Iranian anti-ship missiles and anti-air missiles. Can you give us some thoughts on that aspect of the war?
Well, I think that's it's a possible use. It's certainly is a possibility, and without going too in depth on this, you could just say that I'm certain that Admiral Cooper has options, that he's probably got at his disposal. Those are also very high risk, as you know. Anytime we're going to go in with forces on the ground, that there's probably it's not going to be as clean or as neat as we might hope for, certainly hope for. But those are logical uses for special forces for sure, raids, of course. And then, of course, if we wanted to do something larger, you might have to bring in more ground forces. Sadly, Ken, I don't think we have an ARG-MU in the region, so we don't have a large Marine presence there. There are Marines involved, of course, and they're doing great work along with the rest of the joint force there. But it'd be fairly limited, I think. And then you'd have to ask, my question would be, what's the purpose? What is the task that we're trying to accomplish with this? And so I think those are just some initial thoughts on that.
Okay. Anything else that you're looking out for? Maybe something in terms of the next phases or what might come?
Well, since I mentioned magazine depth, I'll go back to that, and you could ask, well, what should you be looking for? Their shot doctrine, that's also been, I think, trying to open this up to arcane military lexicon, but you think of in terms of the air and missile defense. When if there's a grizzly bear running at you and you have a rifle, you might not want to shoot it just once. You might want to shoot it twice. So shot doctrine deals with that to raise the assurance level. Oftentimes you're going to shoot two or possibly three missiles, and that's where the whole missile math comes in that people have rightly noted. But I think one of the things I'd be looking at is if that interception rate decreases, why has it decreased? So it's high. It's a good news story so far. Why has it decreased? Is it because of the magazine depth, or is it for some other reason? You also mentioned, or we've talked about, or hinted at the drone problem. I think this is a challenge. I'll be interested to see in this more dynamic phase. I'm using the word that Admiral Cooper used last week in his press briefing, to see whether we can have some continued degradation to a degree where it's always going to be a terror weapon. This is like the V1 and V2 bombs in Germany back in World War II. Scary, loud, scary, not as lethal. Of course, when it hits you, it's very lethal. But this is a problem that is going to persist if we can't get after some of the depth of the Iranians magazine. So those are a couple of things I'd be watching for. Of course, I'm interested, like everybody else. I think President Trump has come out and said, the boots or the Kurdish issue, using the Kurds in some sort of resistance force mode is off the table, at least for now. But that doesn't mean that it couldn't come back into the fore. So yeah, those are a few things that I'd like to keep an eye on.
Those are great. All right, let me turn things over to Colby now. And Colby, obviously the markets are on a wild ride here. Oil up over $100 a barrel. Help us understand what's going on there. Give us a sense of where this might be headed.
Sure, thanks, Ken. It would probably not be too much of an exaggeration to say that today we're at the very early stages of what could be the largest energy crisis since the 1970s. And 20% is really the magic number here, and there's a couple of different reasons for that. The strait being effectively closed in the way that it is more or less cuts off the world from 20% of its oil supply. That number fluctuates over time, but that's the rough number. Not just crude oil, but very critically things like gasoline, diesel. If anyone's going to be going on a plane trip at the next couple of weeks and hasn't booked yet, you'll notice that the price of your ticket is going to go up. That's just because of the amount of jet fuel that the world has lost access to coming out of the Gulf. Alternate export routes may cover around 20% of what has been lost, but not very much more than that. And we've also lost 20% of the world's LNG supply because of Qatar Energy's force majeure that we talked about in one or two of our sessions last week. That also has to be considered alongside the fact that some of the alternate export routes outside of the Gulf are also vulnerable at various points. I'd single out Fujairah, which has been subject to kind of constant harassment by a lot of these drones that we've been discussing. Fujairah is where the ADCOP pipeline, which has around 1.8 million barrels a day in export capacity, runs, and that's the UAE's alternate route outside of the Gulf. So these incidents at Fujairah do make that much more difficult. To be clear about what's actually happened so far, because there have been a lot of attacks on energy infrastructure, and that list gets longer every day, we have not as yet seen anything that is on the scale of the Abqaiq attack in 2019. I think to some extent, we're all recalibrating what we consider to be a major disaster at this point, but there isn't anything on that scale that has yet taken place. A lot of what's happened so far have been attacks on tankers, both in and outside of the Gulf, and oil storage facilities, which you've seen in Oman. You've seen that here in the UAE. And of course, with some of the really horrific images coming out of Tehran in the last day or so, you've seen it take place inside of Iran. These kinds of attacks have a huge visual impact. They certainly in Tehran are having a huge impact on civilian population and on the environment. They don't really have a major supply impact unless dozens of these storage tanks are being lost. So what we have right now is a shipping problem. The strait being shut the way it is has pushed us to a point where production is beginning to be shut in at various places around the Gulf. And the list is, again, growing by the day. This started in Iraq, where production has dropped to the tune of close to 2 million barrels per day by now. There's production that will take place to satisfy local markets. But Iraq does not have loads of storage capacity, which is where oil has to go once it's pumped out of the ground. Refineries typically have to cut their throughput rates, because the storage space for refined products will fill up. So you are starting to see that in Kuwait as well. And that is also likely spreading to Saudi Arabia and to the UAE, although to a lesser extent, again, because of some of those alternate export routes that I mentioned. So if you can get shipping moving through the strait again, you will start to see a decrease in price, not a major one, because this is still a very dangerous situation. But what we understand from some of the shippers and people in the trading community that I and my colleagues have spoken with here is that there is a very strong feeling that there will be a need for some kind of a multinational effort to guarantee safe passage through the strait. There's a feeling that the messaging coming out of the White House on some of the moves that could be made there is a step in the right direction. But also that this situation is so volatile that the shipping community does seem to be leaning towards a preference for more involvement from potentially France. I know Emmanuel Macron has talked about getting involved in this situation than it just specifically being the United States. If you can get past that point, then you can start to hopefully reverse some of these shut-ins, because the longer that it takes to reverse the shut-ins, the longer it will take to restart production again, and that will vary from field to field. One of the things I always like to say is that not all barrels are created equal. It depends on which kind of a resource you're dealing with. But what we can do in the meantime is tap inventories. Now, the United States has a strategic petroleum reserve. I think we will probably see releases from the SPR in the coming days. There's talk of a coordinated release of oil inventories from G7 countries. We may have some obstacles to getting there, but that is likely to take place. Over the last 18 months or so, when oil was much cheaper, China had been taking advantage of that and filling a lot of its own stocks. There's probably only a few dozen people in the world that know what the real number is of Chinese oil storage, but they are set. Now, that doesn't mean, however, that it won't have a market impact. Beijing has directed refiners to either completely stop or drastically slow down exports of refined products. And that will hit markets hard. It's not just about crude markets, which I think we're all about to find out in some pretty uncomfortable circumstances. I mentioned jet fuel earlier. Gasoline is already up, diesel, others. All of these inputs that are necessary for daily economic life to go on all around the world are going to be moving through markets that are really going to tighten very quickly. Other places where you'll start to see that impact are South Asia. India does not have a lot of oil storage and reserve. Places in its periphery like Bangladesh and Pakistan are also starting to feel a pinch already. You may see some moves by Iran to release some of the oil that it has in floating storage. I think the last estimate that I saw was that it's got about 155 million barrels in floating storage that would, in all likelihood go to China, because that's really the only place Iranian oil goes nowadays. But refined product storage around the world is generally lower. So all of these things are really going to tighten up. And as I've mentioned in the past, and I'd probably just leave it here for now, tapping storage is not a solution to the loss of production. Storage is finite, of course, production is too, but storage is quite more finite. And then even when if and when production does restart before some of those stocks run out, the market will act with the knowledge that storage and inventories are lower. And that will put some upward pressure on prices, even if a crisis does get resolved. So this is creating a situation in the energy markets that cannot be turned off and turned on again like a light switch. It is going to take time to sort this out, and there will be a lot of price pressure. And then finally, and I'd leave it here also. The war in this region is most imminently a political and a security crisis for the Gulf states themselves. But when we peel back that layer, oil prices are high, but that doesn't mean a lot if you're exporting exponentially less oil. So it does have the potential to be a fiscal crisis in some of the Gulf states as well. We'll see how some of the math on that shakes out. But especially for places like Iraq that are really almost totally shut in on exports right now, there's a real dangers down the road to that as well.
That's terrific, Colby. And you actually managed to answer my follow-up question to you. So I'm going to jump right in. Let's start asking questions from the audience. And the first one I've got is for Alex. And Alex, obviously, the U.S. has hinted, and the Israelis have more or less said that they're going to try to kill Mujtaba Khamenei. If that is successful, if he is taken out too, do you see that as potentially having an outsized impact on the regime? If the U.S. and Israel are able to systematically start killing supreme leaders, is that the kind of thing that could pull the regime apart, do you think?
So Ken, I'll take the first one first. If Mujtaba is assassinated by the United States or Israel, I don't think anything fundamentally changes in terms of the regime's posture right now. Again, essentially, it's reflecting the IRGC's posture. So Mujtaba was their preferred candidate. In many ways, the United States actually, by killing Mujtaba's father, created the opportunity for Mujtaba to rise to the top. I don't think he would have otherwise risen to the top. I was among those who were skeptical about it, because we've heard for years about Mujtaba taking over. I was among the skeptics, but now with his father suddenly dying the way he did, it created an opportunity. But even with him now as his father's successor, if he's somehow assassinated, I don't think it's going to fundamentally change where IRGC is, because as I said, because this is really important, Ken, Mujtaba Khamenei didn't groom the IRGC. IRGC groomed Mujtaba Khamenei. And that's really important. And I'm sure there are others who've been groomed, and they'll be replacing Mujtaba. But you then raise a systematic elimination of leaders in the regime. That's a different story. At some point, the balance will tip. And that's when you have a legitimate question to ask. What we know is a pretty big regime ship with different factions in it. You got the ultra right wingers, you got the pragmatic technocrats, you got the middle part. If you take one, if the United States focuses on a set of elements that we would associate with the hardliners, and they're eliminated, then what's left of the regime? I'm speculating, but I think it's a good educated guess that what's left is more power in the hands of the technocrats who are least likely or less likely to be targeted. So I can give you names, what that means in terms of personalities. But I mentioned this earlier. As of right now, Ken, the likes of Pezeshkian or, I don't know, Hassan Khomeini, others who you might associate with people willing to overtly express the willingness to change course, those people right now are on the defensive. You time this bad, you will be, never mind the Americans, the Israelis assassinating you. Somebody from inside could assassinate you. So much of this is about timing. We're only 10 days into this war. I say only, I know how tragic it's been for so many people in different places. But my point is, as this continues, so much of who's got political power might change. Yesterday, we know who had the political power. IRGC, Revolutionary Guards. They put Mustafa Khamenei in the office of the Supreme Leader. But that might not be the case in 10 days' time, or a month's time, or 6 months' time, certainly. And I will also stop by saying this. Seems to me that the regime actually, overall, in terms of who's in the driver's seat, they think they can stay in this war. They think they can stay in this war, and it might actually legitimize them in ways that, because otherwise they had been a disaster for the country. And now, and this is where it's so become so, Colby was talking about the images coming out of Iran. Over the course of 24 hours, you could see, you could sense the shift in Iranian public opinion on this war, from a war against the regime to a war on Iran. Particularly the Israelis are getting hit hard. Some of their officials talking about take out all Iranian oil and infrastructure. That doesn't point to regime change targeting Islamic Republic. That points to the collapse of Iran as a country, which would be not only disaster for the people of Iran, would be disaster for the Middle East, it would be disaster for the Europeans. And I would argue even though the US doesn't get impacted because of distance immediately, it's not good news for the United States either. And I think that you didn't ask me about this, but the narrative part here is critical, because as long as the United States doesn't have an end game in mind, and I don't see what that end game frankly is, the one thing you could at least hope for is that people of Iran rise up, right? That's the one hope you could have. And you start killing girls in schools and blowing up infrastructure, and I'm not saying these was deliberate, we know they were not, but that's the nature of war. But the point I'm making is the public opinion there suddenly might actually favor these individuals in the Revolutionary Guards, whose policies, frankly, have been disasters, brought a country to this point of disaster in the first place.
That's terrific, Alex. And in particular, I think the point that you made there, that the regime, the Guard, may decide to protract this conflict, that they may see it as in their interest. I think it's a hugely important one that we should be thinking much more about. Great. All right. Got an interesting question, which I'm going to pose to both General Mundy and to Colby, because I think that it spans both of your interests. Actually, we have several questions on this topic, which is Kharg Island. Right. This is an idea that's out there in the media a lot. The Israelis have floated it for several different years, this idea of seizing Kharg Island. So, General, I'm going to ask you first about the military side of doing that, and then Colby, ask you about what the economic energy consequences of it. General, you said we haven't got a MEU in the area. Going to be hard to grab Kharg without one, but if obviously we can bring Marine assets in there. Talk to us about the military feasibility of this kind of an operation.
Sorry, I had you on mute there. Yeah, I noticed that kind of surfaced yesterday or a couple of days ago, and it would be probably a logical target. Now, Kharg Island's a big island too. That's going to soak up a lot of forces. It wouldn't, it looks small on a map maybe, but it's pretty big. So that would be one consideration. I've just thinking about it, Ken, the logic of it would obviously be to help control things in the strait. And that's one of the things I didn't mention when you asked were there some other things you're looking for. The Iranians still have some asymmetric means up their sleeves. We haven't heard about, we haven't seen them try to mine yet, but I know that's come up as a topic in previous discussions. This might be a means to kind of help control from a terrain perspective the shipping channel that goes through there that Colby talked about, and so it would be potentially a logical, at least initially it would make some sense to do that. But again, I think the forces that you'd have to commit to that would be significant, and then to buy down the risk, of course, you're gonna put a force essentially in the outskirts or very close to it is Iranian territory. that might expose it to threats, of a more direct nature. Obviously, they're probably not going to give it up willingly, and so it would be a contested. It wouldn't, again, not antiseptic. It would require a whole lot of combat power and a whole lot of attention and focus from assets that we're currently using to go after the ballistic missiles. Hopefully, a more concerted effort against the drones would probably have to be diverted to help support this sort of a thing. So, it depends on the so many things, and whether or not the payoff would be worth the risk.
So, General, I'm not going to let you go without, because I know I'll get a follow-up on this. But give us a sense of what size of ground force you think would be needed. Are we talking about, a MEU where it's a battalion-sized ground element? Are we talking about a regimental combat team? Do we need to go bigger? And again, we won't hold you to this, but just to give some sense of the effort.
Well, some of that depends on, the nature of the enemy forces. So you'd have to look at what it is that still exists on Kharg Island, if there is anything on Kharg Island, and what their capabilities are. So there is a correlation of force issue here, for one. Secondly, probably something more than a MEU, probably something less than a MEF. So brigade for us is the sort of thinking that might go into something like that. And of course, again, I mentioned that it would have to be supported by a lot of air and naval assets to pull this off, to be able to do that. So there you go.
Fair enough. Okay, Colby, over to you now. So what would be the economic and energy impact? I think, if you want to talk about the impact on Iran, that's fine. But I think that the question is really about what the impact on the rest of the world are.
Yeah, for sure. So, for anyone listening who may be less familiar with the significance of Kharg Island to Iran's oil sector, that's the outlet for roughly 90% of Iran's oil exports. That, exports vary in number. I mean, if you go by what, the moving average would have been for the last couple of months before the war, let's call it 1.5 million barrels a day. So if an effort to, seize that island and hold it were to result in those facilities being significantly damaged or destroyed, that's not something that can be rebuilt overnight. I mean, that is, let's call it 1.5 million barrels a day that's going to go off the market with no quick way to return. I was having a discussion with a colleague of mine earlier today, and he said a major incident at Kharg Island is your fast track to $150 barrel oil. So, as I was mentioning, pretty much all of Iran's oil goes to China. But if China is not getting it from Iran, they have to go and get it from somewhere else. And it offsets it from somewhere else in the market. And that's how it works. So, I would think, and maybe this is more of a question for the general or for the other military minds. I would think that certainly from the economic standpoint, doing something like interdiction of Iranian tankers would be lower risk. That's obviously consumes a lot of resources as well, and there are a lot of Iranian tankers out there, to be sure. But you have to think of, I think, the day after to a degree as well, and depending on what kind of Iran you either expect to be dealing with or want to make a deal with, that island is the economic jugular of the country in many ways, and so I think the risk of significantly damaging or destroying it is something that should be treated with just enormous levels of caution, because Iran has maybe one other terminal outside the strait called Jask that I think can export around 300,000 barrels a day or so. That's a fraction of what goes through Kharg. So the economic effect there would be massive. And it takes a lot of the economic incentives away that might otherwise be there, again, depending on who you're dealing with in Iran to try to bring the conflict to a close.
Great. Okay, Alex, back to you. Bunch of questions about IRGC leadership And again, the impact of the targeted killings, the assassination campaign against them. And here, I think that the key question is, do you believe that this approach to the IRGC could really start to affect either their institutional cohesion or their willingness to continue to prosecute this fight?
Very quickly, Ken, I just want to comment on what we heard about Kharg Island, because I was talking about Iranian infrastructure and being cautious when you target
sure.
it. I could just imagine Kharg Island being a target for the United States, that, where this war is going to go. I mean, we're no longer talking about ballistic missiles. This is an open-ended war. And again, I would worry about what happens to that public opinion inside of the country, again, and outside too. Plays into the regime's narrative. It does. And by the way, on retaliation, that's the kind of step you take, then anything within the Iranian vicinity is open target. And it's not, you don't just worry about 90% of Iran's oil being taken out from Kharg Island. You worry about what the Iranians can take out in the region. So as far as I can tell, the Iranians are engaging right now in this, what they call sequential escalation. You hit our desalination plant, we hit your desalination plant, you hit our refinery, we hit your, they're not going to make it, in terms of hitting U.S. homeland, obviously, but they're going to hit anything they can get in the neighborhood that they can reach. And we've seen they're targeting to the extent they can Western, particularly U.S. companies. They're going for those first. Again, that's part of the same playbook, getting pressure on Donald Trump to end this war. And so, in terms of the question, Ken, look, I think a couple of things. I noticed so many of the IRGC folks that come on TV and talk, they're part of the first generation revolutionaries. They're men in their 70s and older. There was certainly in the young 20s in 1979. They are out there risking it more. The younger ones who are presumably doing all the shooting of missiles and drones, you don't see them that much. And we actually, overall, we don't have a good sense of what makes that group of people tick. Is it ideology only, or is it a combination of ideology? And this being in the IRGC is essentially a career that you pick because it comes with lots of perks. I tend to believe that, and I go back to 97. I go back to 97 when Mohammad Khatami, the reformist candidate, won a landslide, and a lot, I remember, if I remember right, majority of IRGC folks, members of IRGC actually voted for Mohammad Khatami. I remember that was a big surprise. Like, well, IRGC are voting for the reformist guy. Yes, they did. But so I would say, remember, IRGC is not a monolith. They got factions within it. They got differences that are generational. The first generation revolutionaries are in a different place, and they might want to sort of leave the stage the way Ali Khamenei did. A lot of the younger ones in their 50s and younger have good reasons. Those who are not hardened ideological, to look for a way out. And then again, it comes down to a judgment call and capacity by the United States to target certain people, and Israel, I should say, target certain people in the ranks of the IRGC that might actually help create the conditions for the so-called reasonable ones to emerge on top. Because one way or another, you have to deal with IRGC if you want Iran to remain as a state and run as a state, because they are everywhere. They're in the economy, they're in the politics, they have intelligence services. The idea that IRGC is only limited to missiles and drones is to misunderstand the depth of IRGC involvement across Iranian society. So I don't know if that answers your question, but as I said, again, I don't know if there's a plan. I don't know if the US has thought about it that far. I don't think they have so far. They might going forward. But if you have thought about it and you kind of are open to the idea of the Islamic Republic survives, you just care about it changes course, then you have to think about who can bring that about, who can keep the country in one piece. And again, then you have to focus specifically on the IRGC commanders within it that you could see emerge as compromises. That doesn't sound too good if you're sitting in Tehran listening to me, but people who are willing to make compromises, essentially. But I also say this, Ken, if you are in the opposition, certainly diaspora opposition, what I just laid out would be a nightmare scenario, because you've essentially replaced Khamenei with the hardened rule of IRGC, although they could change course. IRGC has all the options in the world. They can be less Islamist, less ideological, become much more focused on nation building at home. And if they do that, then ballistic missiles and drones is not what the average Iranian cares about. It's the basic things in life they care about. So they have options to change course. I don't know if the United States and Israel have thought about it, have the capacity to shape the trajectory of where the IRGC is going, including through assassinations of others that they might not want to see around.
Outstanding. All right. Another clump of questions, which again, I'm going to pose to General Mundy and to Colby. And this is about U.S. relations with the Gulf states in the wake of this war. And the questions are more or less, given what we've been seeing, the missile strikes now, hits on desalination plants, right? Do you see the war ultimately strengthening US-GCC ties or causing a distancing? And again, I think that there's a kind of a military political dimension, which I'd like to put to the general, and then there's an economic political dimension, which I'd like to put to Colby. So, General, why don't you start us off? What's your sense of how the Gulf states are responding in terms of our relationship and what we might see going forward?
Well, from a mill-to-mill perspective, Ken, I think it's strengthening. Obviously, necessity is probably part of that, but we've had a very strong relationship with them in spite of wide policy swings between administrations over the years. In fact, in some ways, that was the kind of continuity between administrations was the military to military relations. But I don't see that weakening at all based on what's going on. If anything, it's strengthening, and they're very glad that we're there. One facet of this, though, and again, I'm kind of reflecting back to my experience in 2019 and 20 in Saudi Arabia. That depends on whether or not we're going to be there for them. Are we just fickle defenders here? Probably not. I don't mean to suggest that we are, but are we going to be there for them over the longer haul, or we pack up our toys and go home here and then leave them on the military side to have to defend? So I think that's the key question here in their minds is, hey, as long as you guys are in this with us, in it with us, we're okay on going forward here. That's kind of the short answer.
Let me just quick follow up on that. If we leave this Iranian regime in place, if we don't finish them off, does that make them even more dependent, want us even more, or does that piss them off and drive them in a different direction?
Militarily, I think it would depend on, because they'd look at it the same way we would. Okay, well, how much do we degrade them? Can they really do anything to us? Are we now on par with them? Are they even less capable and less of a threat, I guess? So that's probably the way that they would look at it, and one of the factors that would weigh into to that, to answer your question.
Very good. Colby?
Yeah, I think one of the more telling things that you've seen in the last few days in that regard was, the report that some of the Gulf states were considering divesting from U.S.-held assets in order to help bear the cost of the war. I think that is less a symptom of some kind of an economic breakup and more something that they probably just think will definitely catch and hold the attention of the Trump administration. There has been a lot of Gulf investment in the U.S. Under both Trump administrations, and there was through the Biden administration as well. I think that that's something that will continue, but I think that where Gulf states see that can be a point of leverage in a situation where I don't want to veer too far into the political realm, but where they feel perhaps that their views on getting into this situation were not taken as seriously as they would have liked them to have been. That is something that they can do that does capture attention. But there are a lot of major U.S. IOCs with exposure to the oil and gas industry in this region. That's something that's been the case for decades. I don't see them pulling out. I don't hear any signs or sounds of the Gulf states not wanting them to be here. I think it's quite to the contrary. So I think that where those ties exist, they'll hold through something like this. But I think there is a clear message being sent that that kind of investment into the U.S. certainly from the Gulf is not unconditional.
That's terrific, Colby. Thank you. All right. John, I got one for you. It was one that you and I actually talked about ahead of time, so I'm glad it was asked, which is Ukraine. Vladimir Zelensky was in the UAE there to help them with their Iranian drone problem. What's your sense of what they might have talked about? How useful would that be? Can Ukraine actually help the Emirates? Can they help all of us?
Yes, they can.
Care
And
to elaborate?
yeah, well, I'll elaborate a little bit. Sure. Um, I didn't. Thanks for that tip, Ken. I think the drones, frankly, are one of the sort of the disappointing features of this conflict, and by that I mean in terms of our preparedness to deal with this. And there are lots of reasons I won't go into about that, but just we've known about it. We've watched what's going on in Ukraine for at least the better part of 3 years here, and yet we still are lagging. We're behind. We're shooting behind the duck on this. So I think it'll receive a concerted effort going forward here. It's probably already is in terms of our the targeting, and the equivalent of the Scud hunts back in the 1991 timeframe. We're now drone hunting or Shahed hunting during the dynamic phase. But the answer is, Ukraine can bring so much experience to us, both technical, because they have developed this fantastic indigenous capability to produce drones in this high-end drone fight with Russia, of course, but also training, I think, and that's critical as well, is how to think about the problem, how to dispose your forces, how to defend, how to set up your defenses to make them harder targets against it. I note that there was a report that said we're going to send in the MEROPS, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, drone system to go after it. And that was a system that was used in Ukraine, I think has already been tested or is being used in Ukraine. And so there's a nice marriage here of Ukrainian support as well as these systems coming in. And of course, it couldn't come at a better time.
Perfect. Okay, we've got 3 minutes, and I want to ask about one issue, and I'm going to put it to all three of you because there are aspects touching on each of you, and that's the idea of blockading Iranian oil. Now, obviously, right now there isn't a whole lot coming out of there, but General, let me start with you. Military feasibility of a blockade. Then, Alex, I'll come to you and ask about the potential impact on Iran, and Colby, to you, impact on energy. So, go ahead, General, start us off.
Yeah, so by that, you're talking about allowing Iran to take oil out of the Gulf. I think we've got the assets there. Certainly, the U.S. Navy could do this probably fairly easily. I don't want to speak for Fifth Fleet or Navy experts out there, but I know that we've got the assets where we could do this and bottle them up. Fairly completely, I guess. As to what the impact of that would be, I'll defer to Colby and Alex. But I think yes, the answer is yes. We could certainly do it. Might take some time, but probably not a lot based on the assets that I see that we have there.
Outstanding. Alex, any political impact, outsized political impact we should consider?
If we're talking Ken inside of Iran, look, obviously it's a huge source of income for them. It have an impact. They have spent the last at least 10 years plus trying to diversify the economy. So Iran today depends less on crude oil income. It's less, I don't remember the numbers, but it's less than half for sure of what the government certainly needs. There'll be some attempts to sort of put, oil back of a truck. Colby can correct me on how much that will get you in terms of income into countries like into Central Asia, into Pakistan, so on. But obviously nothing in terms of the volumes that they've been selling to the Chinese. And that takes me to an unknown, frankly. If you are United States and you stop the flow of discounted Iranian oil going to China, will China care? Does China want to pick up a fight and stop you from doing that? I don't know, but I could see that as being a hope on the part of the Iranians that might matter, and maybe the Russians too. There are reports that are trying to get the Russians and the Chinese to do more to help them. So far, I don't think anything significant has been given to them. But when we talk about oil, China is suddenly, losing money because they're getting a pretty nice discount here out of Iranian oil, and that will be lost. Do they care, as I said? Do they think this is worth fighting the US over? Or, they just learn to live with it? In which case, I mean, it's a long-term risk. I don't think the Iranian state's going to collapse over the course of a few months just because oil income drops. But surely going forward, that's going to be massively going against their interest ability to stay the course with the loss of that kind of oil income. I'll stop there. And I apologize for leaving early, but I got to go to the next one. And it's a pleasure to be with you all. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Okay, Colby, we got 30 seconds. Any additional impact?
Yeah, so I'll say two things about it. I mean, it would be a loss of, again, that some 1.5 million barrels a day in supply that I referred to earlier. What I would say is that I think, if you do open up the strait and restore this freedom of navigation, that is something that OPEC could potentially make up for, although everyone's balances for the year are upset at this point anyway. And then the final point, I think, is just that, in my mind, is an option that certainly would be preferable to the risk of destroying facilities at Kharg Island, which would take billions of dollars and a lot of time to repair.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you both, Colby, General Mundy. Fantastic having you on. Again, incredibly enlightening, incredibly useful. And for the viewers back at home, we'll be doing this again Wednesday morning at 11 a.m. General Frank McKenzie, General Mundy's old boss, will be joining us then, and hopefully bring you just as much enlightenment as we did this morning. Thank you all very much. Have a good day.